Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, the podcast that looks at geopolitical developments in historical context with myself, Ali Ansari, and my colleague, Suzanne Rain. There's been a lot going on in the last couple of weeks, which we thought we would come and review. It's an ongoing process, to coin a phrase. So we're going to look at it in the round. So Suzanne, what is your first sense of what's been going on and the consequences?
You'll notice, listeners, that Ali hasn't mentioned where it is that there's been a lot going on. So we could start from anywhere now. I think, though, Ali, what you're talking about is the change, the revolution in Syria. Let's call it a revolution. A very slow and then suddenly very speedy revolution. And Ali, we are not a breaking news podcast, let's be clear. And we're also not a podcast where we suddenly try and become experts on everything. So if you want real expertise on Syria, this is probably not the podcast for you. Although what both of us have is a lot of experience of the area and of political instability in different ways. So I think, Ali, we've agreed that we're going to talk about what's happened in Syria, but try and put it in a slightly longer perspective or give people new ways to think about it rather than doing a minute by minute account of who's going to take what position and what we think is going to happen next.
Yeah, I think that's right. As we were discussing earlier, I think we are a sort of a reflective podcast for the discerning listener. And I think this is the point, that we want to look at the broader picture and, see the wood rather than focus too specifically on the trees, if I can put it that way. I'm not sure that's the best analogy to take, but I think people listening will soon get our drift, because it is a fast-moving development. It's going to be pretty consequential, but obviously it's difficult to know in what direction things will go. But it's something that I think, both of us felt that we ought to do a podcast on and discuss it, because obviously it's going to have fairly profound geopolitical consequences for the wider region. I mean, I can obviously talk about my area, Iran, for those in any doubt. But clearly it has, I think, taken people by surprise. And I think that issue of surprise is one that we will discuss as far as policy is concerned.
Because we discuss this quite a lot,
we do,
Ali?
Yeah.
And I've been saying till I'm blue in the face, I know you share this view, if we could just abolish the word predict, we would all be so much better at foreign policy, because failure to predict is something that you can only do if you are completely abstracted from the reality. As soon as you become a part of it, and that includes, obviously, if you work for a government, but also the journalists and media, as soon as you say something, you are changing what happens next in different ways. So let's not talk about why did no one predict. And instead, I think we both agree, what we're talking about is anticipating something in order to provide some kind of warning that something might be about to change, which then enables preparatory action. And I don't want to say influence action, although one of the problems that Syria has had for many, many, many years is that it becomes a place that multiple other countries wish to exercise their geopolitical influence through.
I think that's right. And the key term there that you used is preparation. I think it's not a question of prediction. And I say this, like you, until I'm blue in the face, to say to people, don't worry about predicting things. These sort of revolutionary events, by their very nature and very definition, are unpredictable. That's why they're revolutionary, in that understanding of it, obviously. But what I think we can be is a little bit better prepared. And there's two things that stand out for me, which are quite interesting. I mean, if we go back to the Arab Spring, I was always very struck that when, Tunisia was kicking off, I think Sarkozy, who was then president of France, was sitting in an airliner with the leader of Tunisia, and they were flying over the Mediterranean, and they were completely caught by surprise, obviously, by the events that had taken place, and nobody was really prepared for anything happening. And I think on this occasion, a number of states, actually, regionally as well. I mean, we're not talking about. I mean, it's not a European or a Western problem, by the way. We're all busy, normalizing the relations with Assad and basically saying, he's just a fact of life. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, last year he was readmitted into the Arab League, wasn't he? So, there was this sort of idea that he's back and we need to, have a dose of what we might call in the common usage of the term as sort of a bit of realpolitik. But clearly people in the region and elsewhere hadn't really anticipated or planned or prepared for the fact that the situation might be much more vulnerable and much more fragile than they'd realized. And I want to suggest to you that one of the reasons about this is, one of our problems is the way in which we do analysis. This is something that you'll be very keen on, I'm sure. But the way we do analysis in some cases where we don't factor in as much those sort of ambiguous elements, if I can put it out, because it's not easy to measure ideologies, ideas, the moral strength of a particular regime. It's much easier to measure things that you can measure, like, the material elements, the physical elements, the tanks, the planes, the presence of a security force. How do you measure the willingness of that security establishment or that defense establishment to actually do the things they need to do to save a particular regime? And that's much, much more difficult. And I think that's one of the things which, as historians, because we do share that thing a bit, as historians, which I think historians, I'll say unashamedly here, I think are better at trying to assess. It's not a science, it's an art, but better at assessing the relative moral strength, shall we say, of particular regimes. And that's really a historical legacy in others. And I think that's been quite interesting because people could look at, and it's always been my grievance, if you will, that people look at a state and they say, it's very strong. A bit like they said with the Shah in 1978, he's got the fifth largest army in the world, therefore he must be very strong, and he's got, large security. So what they weren't able to factor in was whether these people were willing to fight to save him, and I think it's much more striking with Syria, isn't it? I mean, basically the thing collapsed like a house of cards. I'm not going to stretch all these wonderful analogies, but, it was a remarkably quick collapse, wasn't it? I mean, this is what's quite striking about it.
Well, I wrote last year, Ali, something about revolutions for Engelsberg Ideas. It's a little case study based on a book written by John Reed, who was an American communist journalist in...
I remember it, yes.
In Russia. He wrote a book called 10 Days That Shook the World, and he wanted it to be an eyewitness account of moments where momentous political things happen. And I pulled out of it just because I think they're so instructive for any momentous moment of political change, a number of themes. And the first one is even the people actually in the thick of the action don't know what's going on at the time. And so you had in November 1917, you had Lenin had only just come back from Finland. He was completely on the wrong side of the town. Trotsky was somewhere else. Neither of them had a clue what was happening. They were in the Smolny Institute. The revolution was taking place. And so when the moment of revolution happens, it's thousands and millions of individual decisions where they're deciding which way it is going. And John Reed described going through the streets of Petrograd, and there was army everywhere, but he wasn't actually sure whether it was Red Army or whether it was Cossacks from the provisional government. I mean, everything was so fluid. And I imagine that is exactly how it currently is in Syria. You have so many militias, you have so many people who were in the Syrian army who now aren't, who may have chosen to change sides at the last minute. And that thing about a transfer of power or a tipping point, power depends on power and it becomes a momentum. And obviously Assad had that, and he had it with the backing of Iran and Russia, and he was able to enforce. And then as particularly HTS, but actually also other opposition groups in other areas, as they then started to build that momentum, so then you had all those personal choices because people thought the balance of power shifted. So I better either, thank goodness I can come out and support this, or I better switch now. I better leave the army now. Otherwise it's done for me. And at that moment, then you get this sum of the personal choices, which becomes the critical mass for change. And that's why in almost all these kind of instances, you suddenly have a break for it, because suddenly the sum of the personal choices becomes the overwhelming, which is then the catastrophe. And often it is the army that's the key, or the military. So because they are the sort of instrument of state power. So if they start to collapse, then you're going to have that momentum, which carries it through. The other theme, which was really clear in John Reed's book, which I think we're seeing in Syria now, and I'm thinking, again, it requires, from our part, understanding and humility as we get drawn into it, is argument. So even if you're on the same side, if you watch what happened in the Bolsheviks in 1917, They were all on the same side, and they had violent disagreements all the time, not about what the end should be, but what was the best way to achieve the end. And then there's others that then have different views on what the end should be. So it is entirely normal, if you think of our own politics, that you're going to have disagreements between everybody now in Syria, because everybody is thinking, how can I make Syria what I think it should be? And the question really is whether they will succeed in building a consensus that the majority of people can stand behind and want to make work. I mean, my personal view is I wish them great luck with that, because it would be only right. But Ali, the next theme that was really clear is compromise.
Yeah.
And you have that question for regimes when they're in this threatened position. Do they compromise in order to maintain power, or do they refuse to compromise and dig down, which is, of course, what Bashar did? And for the challenger, do they compromise? Do they say, thank you, you've given us a bit, we're happy? Or do they keep going until they break it? And in this case, obviously, you had, since Bashar wouldn't compromise, then the question didn't really arise, actually. And I suppose now, for Ahmad al-Shara, former Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, that question about compromising some of the ambitions of the Sunni Islamists in order to create an inclusive and harmonious new Syria will be the critical one to watch. And then the final theme, which came out really clearly from my studies, my very small studies of the Russian Revolution, is that when you write the history, there's a date where it ends.
Yeah.
But in fact, while you're living it, there isn't a date when it ends. There's a date when something might happen. But the question about, is that then finished, is absurd. And so we've had a momentous event, but we're now just getting on with creating new history, I suppose.
Well, I think the idea of compromise is essential. And there's two other things that I draw from what you said, which I think, you could apply, absolutely lock, stock and barrel to the revolution in Iran, actually. I mean, it's very, very key. I mean, there are two things, and this is why, when we go back to the idea of predictability or otherwise, they're very, very difficult to sort of discern and analyze. You have to be a very acute analyst in one sense, but you also have to be quite lucky, actually, in some ways, to pick out the trends and the decisions that are being made that matter. So one of the things that I think is very strong is contingency in that, and as you say, the very detailed level of decision making, which may seem very trivial when we look on from a distance, but at a very particular and local level is a decision that could tip the balance. I mean, it could be as you say, a decision by a local garrison commander not to resist or something like that. I mean, and that could be the thing that tips things over. And I think the other thing, which I think goes back to what I was saying also, which I think you've drawn out very well as well, is the psychology of it all. And again, this is extremely difficult to assess unless you have, in a way, people on the ground who understand very well the sort of mindset of the individuals involved. And this can be obviously extremely difficult. But I was very struck, when I was doing my studies on the revolution in Iran, someone said to me, and he was quite clear, he said, people talk about this as a political revolution, a religious revolution, a social revolution, all these different adjectives. He said, but for me, it was a psychological revolution. And I sort of asked him, what exactly he meant. He said, because for us, it was this idea that the Shah represented a certain authority that nobody dared challenge. And then suddenly people started to challenge. And lo and behold, he didn't really react. I mean, this was the thing, and once they realized, once that sort of the fear, respect, or whatever you want to call it, actually, I mean, it can be a variety of different emotions. Once that had been shattered, there was no way really that the regime could recover. I mean, it was impossible, unless in some ways, I always used to contrast what happened in Syria with what happened in Iran. I mean, the Shah, basically, I think to his credit in some ways as an individual, I mean, I'm not sure the consequences of the country were terribly good, but as he said, I can't build this throne on blood and I'm not going to shoot all my countrymen. Assad obviously took the other route and decided I'm going to stick it down and I'll double down and I'll use, the Russians and the Iranians and others and it was very interesting to me that the Iranian advice, I think, to Assad was, don't make the mistake of the Shah, double down, get in there, stop it. Because of course, in the Iranian case, and this is something that a lot of historians overlook, well, not overlook, but they tend to rush over. When the regime did use violence in what was known as the Jaleh Square massacre at the time on Black Friday in September 78, and around 80 people were killed, there was a sudden ceasing of the protests. I mean, people basically stopped. I mean, they said, whoa, we're not going to get. But then they sort of realized that the Shah was more horrified than they were at what had happened, and therefore it wasn't going to happen again, and therefore they came out. With Assad, of course, that just wasn't the case, and he went for it. But it's an interesting, I suppose, in some ways, political morality tale, whatever, that, what Assad did is he doubled down, used extreme violence, because, we can now see, in much more gory detail, the level of violence that he used against his own countrymen. But that still hasn't saved him, because ultimately what's happened is it's, in a sense, hollowed out. There comes a point when people are not willing to continue on this line again. And there's that psychological moment when, on one side, I suppose, the forces of coercion, the security forces decide we've had enough, we're not doing this anymore. Or there's I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I would be fascinated to hear if we ever get a detailed story of what happened in the last couple of weeks of the Assad regime is, when did he take the decision that I'm out of here? When did he decide I'm going to Moscow?
Well, he has said that he didn't.
Oh, so what?
So this is why we're not a breaking news.
I know,
podcast.
Excellent. This is good. So what did he say?
He said on the BBC, or no, sorry, he's on the BBC. He is reported as having given this.
Because he hasn't done any. He hasn't actually spoken to anyone yet, has he?
Yeah, he had somewhere on. Sorry, this is. Oh, no. He is reported to have said, and I'm on the spot now, but he's reported to have said that he had no intention of giving up and going to Moscow, but he had gone to some military base to,
rally the troops.
Exactly. And unfortunately, it's become clear while he was there that the opposition effect was occurring. And the Russians had said, actually, we need to get out of here and come with us. You're coming on this.
Oh, so basically he's saying that, well, that's interesting in itself. So he'd gone to a military base. He's saying he'd gone there and he'd made an assessment himself that actually people didn't have the will to fight anymore. And the Russians had also made the decision for him.
No, he's not saying he made the assessment. He said that the Russians made the decision for him.
Because the Iranians are saying, because the Iranians are now sort of running around trying to spin it, obviously, and this failure, because it is a strategic failure for them. And they're saying that Assad never asked for our help. And if he'd asked for our help, we would have given it to him. But that's turning out also not to be true either, because, as we might have suspected, but Ayatollah Khamenei has then since said in a rather sort of curious, sermon, it's sort of like a slightly apologetic sermon, actually. He said that, we did want to send help, but the Americans and the Israelis had closed the airspace and therefore we couldn't, which I thought was quite revealing, actually, because they constantly sort of say how, if Israel looks at us badly, we'll, destroy them or whatever. And here he's saying that they couldn't actually get anything over because the airspace had been closed and there's nothing they could do about it. So in a sense, he's almost saying that we were willing to offer help. Now, I would sort of suggest that that's really for his domestic audience and, perhaps nothing else.
Well, it depends what kind of help, because they'd already been offering, obviously, such help. I'm just, Ali, since you asked, since you raised it, to be clear, there was a statement on Telegram,
right,
which it was the Telegram channel that belonged to the Syrian presidency, whether or not
Assad had anything to do with it.
Yeah. But he said that as Damascus was falling, he went to a Russian military base in Latakia to oversee combat operations, only to see that the Syrian troops had abandoned positions. And the airbase then came under intensified attack by drone strikes. And there was no viable means of leaving the base. So Moscow requested that the base's command arrange an immediate evacuation to Russia on the evening of Sunday, the 8th of December. This took place a day after the fall of Damascus, following the collapse of the final military positions and the resulting paralysis of all remaining state institutions. And the statement says, at no point during these events did I consider stepping down or seeking refuge, nor was such a proposal made by any individual or party. So that is what he is alleged to have said.
But that's another reason why we are a reflective podcast, because I think it may come out in the next weeks and months that that's a very scripted statement by Assad, and that he maybe was out of the country before that. I mean, this, I find it quite striking that he's basically saying in that he didn't decide to leave until Damascus had fallen. I got the impression that he was out well before Damascus had fallen. But who knows? Who knows? I mean, we don't know yet. We don't know the details, do we?
Ali, I've got a couple of other themes that I want to discuss. And the first is, we were talking about analysis. And analysis is hard because it requires a lot of information to analyze.
Yes.
And somebody's got to collect that information wherever it might be, whether it's on the internet, whether it's from talking to people on the ground, whatever it is. And then they've got to get it to the analysts who have to have the level of knowledge and understanding and the resources to think about it all. And one of the problems that we have in the West is we're not resourced to do, you can't do everything. And we see this from our own news coverage. It's impossible. So much is happening, but also everybody has these, very short attention spans. We all do. So you can't, we focused on Syria for a very long time, and then other things happened. I had observed, I tried, for what it's worth, every time I've been in things where we discuss the Middle East, I have inserted the words Syria, Iraq and Jordan, because people have stopped talking about Syria, Iraq and Jordan.
Brilliant.
Because we talked about those a lot. And now we're talking about Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Iran. And there's a bit in the middle, which people,
Absolutely.
which people
Absolutely.
come on, and I think they kind of thought, well, we talked about that for loads. And the bit that I think was hardest for the analysts properly to understand was what the Syrian rebel forces were doing, partly because of this Al-Qaeda hintergrund of Tahrir Sham, which means that it's kind of difficult because it's a terrorist group. So how do you understand them? It's difficult to get there. It's difficult to talk to people. And so, there's a couple of people like Charles Lister who have been following it all the way through, who definitely said, things are changing, watch this, things are changing in how they relate to other people, things are changing in terms of the momentum they're building. But most people just were looking somewhere else or didn't have the amount of information that they needed. And that, I think, is always the case. You're always going to be surprised by the thing you're not looking at. And that's why, Ali, whenever we're talking about Iran, I'm always saying, but do we understand all the parties? And you and I have some debates because I think that the BBC loves to do exposés of the opposition, because the opposition are exciting and dynamic and revolutionary, and because they have Western aims in different ways. They want to be more liberal and open. And therefore, it's a really good news story that people think will get the listeners in. And you and I have had a bit of a disagreement, because I think that is obscuring an understanding of all the other forces at play in Iran. But you disagree with that.
I do. Well, no, I do, partly because I think you're quite right to focus on, your criticism really is of the media there.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the case in policy circles. I think people are more aware, if not necessarily more aware, they're certainly, a bit like Syria. Let's use the question of Syria, this idea that this is a strong state that will remain stable. Mm. I think that discussion within policymaking circles is much more contested. Let me put it that way. I think the media, yes, likes a good story, and I think you're quite right about that. But, in my own debates, the reason why and it's a slight disagreement. I don't think the disagreement is that profound, but I think in terms of emphasis, I've been pushing back, I think, against this notion that authoritarian states, because they're authoritarian, are somehow inherently stable or are strong and stable. And, this is nothing new, of course. If you go back to the report that the Foreign Office did on the fall of the Shah, very famous report that Nick Brown wrote up on the revolution and what British policy could have done better. There's a great line in there from the British ambassador who in Tehran at the time, who took a lot of the flack, of course, Sir Anthony Parsons. And he says in there that, we have to accept that authoritarian regimes are inherently actually, we can't talk about stability of authoritarian states in the same way that we might talk about the stability of, say, a Western democratic state. Of course, he's talking in 78, 79, and, obviously the wider lay of the land is somewhat different to today. But still, I think that holds true. And I'm
interrupting to say I utterly agree with you.
Right. So, just in case our listeners are a bit worried, there is no vast disagreement between myself and Sue.
There's no disagreement on that point.
Yeah, but there is just this, and I entirely agree with you actually on the element that, we have to, this is the interesting thing. In terms of, the young Turks, as I've sort of dubbed them in a sense, in Tehran, who are the young zealots who are coming up, who think that the revolution hasn't really been fulfilled to the extent that it should be, and they're pushing. The question really we have to assess is how representative they are, what sort of influence they have. And I think the consequence of Syria has been very striking, because here you find, and quite rightly, as you would sort of say, there's been a lot of criticism internally about what the regime did. And of course, the hardline criticism from the younger sort of zealot, why didn't we fight? Why didn't we do this? And I would take two things from this. One is they clearly didn't have the impact that they may have had because they weren't able to stop this complete screw up. On the other hand, they clearly are an element, they are a factor there. You hear their voice, they're quite vocal. But I think
Iran, are you
in
talking
Iran,
about
I'm talking about, yes, in Iran.
Yes.
And, they're criticizing, as I said, the regime, and I think that's why Ayatollah Khamenei has been somewhat apologetic about it all, to be honest. Saying, oh, we tried to fly in, but we couldn't because the airspace was closed. I mean, he's being very pragmatic about it. But it's also a bit humiliating for him because, previously, there are interviews with him and these sort of young zealots, and he's full of encouragement. Yes, fight the good fight and all this. Now he's basically saying that we couldn't fight the good fight because we just didn't have the capability. Basically, we didn't have the ability to do it. And of course, this annoys them. And I suppose my interest in that is the internal dynamic. What are they going to say? Are they going to say, we've been fooled? We were told we were a great power that could do all sorts of things. And now we're being told, actually, a lot of this is rhetoric. Now, that's one possibility. The other possibility is, and I know we discussed this earlier, would they rally round, for instance, would they sort of look at, and this is, I think, a possibility, certainly, they'd say, oh, well, Ayatollah Khamenei, he's old, he's on his way out. We need to rally round his prospective heir. And so that's also another possibility, that, they will rally round, say, Mujtaba, as I've said, and use him as a vehicle to get their more hardline vision through. But that in itself is, being articulated and argued within a much broader context of the fact that the Iranian state itself is in a very dire state. And there was a recent interview with an economist actually in Iran. They're all these poor economists are all having nervous breakdowns in Iran, which is interesting to watch. And he basically said, he said, how did the Soviet Union fall? The Soviet Union didn't fall because there was a mass revolution or anything. It fell because it failed to deliver. And it failed to deliver on all sorts of things and basically collapsed, hollowed itself out from the inside out. And he said, this is the danger we have. We're always looking for opposition that's going to come and overthrow us. But actually, it may just be that we just fail to deliver and the whole thing begins to sort of collapse from inside. And, it's a great fear for the Iranians, of course, because they have lived in the shadow of what we call the Gorbachev. They say, we don't want to go down the route of Gorbachev. Look what Gorbachev did. And I think they believe very strongly in Putin's argument that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century and so on and so forth. And, they also buy into that, but they don't really have a solution for it. And actually, this interview with this economist was very telling. He said, whatever choice we have is bad. He basically said, these are the things we can do and none of them are good. And again, that's very interesting. Now, to go back to your point, I think these zealots in the system don't see it that way, obviously. They think that, everything. But, sooner or later, reality bites, doesn't it? And I think this Syria episode, this collapse in Syria, was a moment when reality bit, and it bit very hard. And it's going to force a huge amount of reflection, debate, argument, possibly even violent argument within Iran about what the hell happened. I always remember that debate in the United States after the revolution, who lost Iran? Which was a rather silly debate at the time. But anyway, they did. And, I think in Iran, they're probably now saying, who lost Syria? Who lost Syria? And who's to blame? And of course, there's going to be a lot of casting the blame round. And so I think that's an interesting thing to look at. And I think your element of your discussion and pointing out that there are people who are even right of Genghis Khan in Iran, that is an element. That is an element. And they will play a role.
And I suppose so my only point is that we shouldn't only look at one side we just be mindful that it's often easier to see one element than
absolutely.
another.
No, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right.
If you look at Iraq before 2003, before the invasion, there was, for better or worse, there was a greater understanding, I wouldn't go very much further, of Saddam Hussein and his government than there was of the opposition. Largely because it was very, very difficult to identify and talk to the opposition or to hear from them because he was oppressing them.
Yes.
So now you have this, my concern is that weirdly, it's easier to hear from the Iranian opposition than it is to hear from the hardliners, because the opposition is reaching out and being amplified by the Iranian diaspora around the world, and the hardliners aren't reaching out. And anyway, there's a couple of other themes that I wanted just briefly to draw out, and we can't do more than that because we're going to run out of time.
We are, because this is a Christmas special. By the way, so we want to keep it short and sweet this time around.
Well, the theme, sort of revolution that always happens next is this question about impunity and integration.
Right.
And again, I was listening to a fantastic talk recently about a row between the British and Americans in 1945 about whether to integrate German civil servants who had worked under the Nazi regime as part of the reconstruction. And the British civil servants said, obviously, just because you worked in the civil service, it doesn't make you de facto evil.
Yeah.
So we should allow Germans to stay. And the Americans were absolutist and said everybody who worked for the civil service in Nazi Germany gets sacked, which is, of course, exactly what happened with the de-Baathification in Iraq.
I was thinking about that. It's almost a carbon copy, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a carbon copy. And there's the guy who was talking about it said, there was a theory that the British civil service were thinking, well, actually there, but for the grace of God go I. And if you choose to serve the state, you are at a certain point. It doesn't mean everybody's evil. So that question for the new leaders of Syria is how to manage that desire for proper justice with a need to make a state that functions, which brings in all the experience and skill of the people who have been running it. And that will obviously play out, and they will require help and guidance, but not intervention. The other thought that I had, Ali, that I feel I really should raise is Ahmed al-Shara. He is utterly fascinating. And we should remember, two things really, that he chose the kunya Jolani, because his family were expelled from the Golan Heights in 1967. Yeah. And if you've had a life-forming or family history-forming experience, that has to be a part of it. And the second is that he spent 5 years in American prisons in Iraq.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
5 long years. Yeah. And that is also a life-forming experience in many different directions, So generally you find that people who've spent a long time in prison do a lot of reflecting. And again, there is a possibility that brings wisdom. It sometimes brings desire for revenge. It can go either way, really. But it also brings a network. That group of people who were in those American prisons in Iraq went on to be the leaders of Islamic State in Iraq, Daesh, when they all got out. And, for better, for worse, just my final point that I feel I really should observe is that we in Europe are still critically dependent on the SDF, the Syrian Kurds, holding a not very clear number, but definitely in the thousands of foreign fighters, European nationals in prisons in eastern Syria. So the question was a very live one of what happens to them now. And the same question about impunity. They committed horrific crimes. Yeah. A number of them haven't come back to their home countries because their home countries just don't want them back because they're too much of a security risk in all sorts of different ways. The Syrian Kurds are being hammered by the Turks. The Americans are supporting the Syrian Kurds, but for how much longer? There's 2 things that could happen to that group of prisoners. Well, 3 things. One is the status quo. The Americans continue to help the Syrian Kurds to hold them. The second is they all suddenly find themselves released because the Turks have pushed down on the Syrian Kurds and they can't hold them. And the third is they all end up in another battle. And that's still between Daesh remnants and the now Syrian government, who have no reason to like them. So this is a big uncertainty at the moment. There could be other options. I've just thought of 3 straightforward ones.
No, I think the things coming out, and I think it is very, very interesting, how this develops. And if you look at, what was his, Ahmed what's his surname again?
Ahmed al-Shara.
Shara. Ahmad al-Shara. I keep calling him Jolani, you see, which is obviously he's dumped that name now. His nom de guerre has gone. I mean, if you look at the way he's acting at the moment, it is quite interesting. You know, you were talking earlier about compromise. Who knows, actually, to be honest? I mean, people always draw, and the analogy that people are drawing is with what Khomeini used to say in 79, you know, particularly about women's veiling and other things, that, you know, this is what an Islamic system would be. So I think it's very difficult to know how that's going to pan out and what the consequences will be, and how, you know, I suppose one of the things that we haven't really looked at, I suppose, but maybe for a later date, is what those powers that have been intervening, Israel, Turkey, you know, the West, regional powers, whatever, how they manage what goes on in the next few months and what their actions may or may not do for the development of Syria in a direction that we don't really know what direction to go. But I think from a Western point of view, obviously, I mean, it would be good if we were able in some ways to influence the direction of travel. And you can clearly see this with his calling for the lifting of sanctions. That, you know, would that be possible? How would that work? Would that help the Syrian state develop in a direction of travel that would be amenable? And I use that term, you know, in a very generous way, amenable to all those stakeholders, if you will, in the region who are looking at what happens. Because I thought your point earlier was an enormously important one. This idea that, you know, we look at these states for a while, we get a bit bored, then we look away, and we sort of ignore the fact that here we have Syria in an extraordinarily sensitive part. I was going to say, are there any parts of the Middle East that aren't sensitive? But I mean, this is sort of right bang in the middle, isn't it? Yeah. And affecting a lot of regional powers, and regional powers clearly have a stake and they want to have a stake. How does that affect the direction of travel and how things work? And I think your comment about, you know, the leadership in Syria, I think is absolutely right. It's fascinating to see how this is developing, but it is a developing story and we have to wait and see how that pans out. And I suppose my great fear is that those Western interlocutors that might have an event, they don't drop the ball, is what I'm sort of thinking, by not having been prepared. To go back to that notion of not being prepared, they don't suddenly sort of make matters worse. I don't think they're the key players, actually, but nonetheless, they can have a role for good or ill. And I think that's important to make sure that at least the best options are put on the table.
One of the things that won't help is everybody piling in.
That's right, yeah.
And clearly at the moment, Israel is piling in. Turkey, Erdogan's made some statements recently about bits of Syria he wants back. Everybody's taking...
That was very striking, actually. You're right. I mean, and people haven't been paying as much attention to that as perhaps they should be.
Well, he's, of course, a NATO member, so
I know.
Great. And obviously America is concerned about Daesh, which is why they're conducting an increasing number of operations in the East against Daesh. So even those three, in theory, you know, they are on the Western, in quotes, side, but none of this is helpful, I think.
Well, what's interesting about that is they are, in theory, on the Western side, but they actually don't all agree on their goals. I mean, you know, each side would probably disagree with the other. So, I mean, I think you're right. I think the real worry is for people, you know, on this side, is that we don't want to reignite a Syrian civil war in which we are all getting drawn in. I mean, that's basically what we don't want. So let's try and do things that will avoid that as far as possible. I don't think at the end of the day, these are things that are entirely contingent on what we do. But nonetheless, the hope must be that we do things that don't push things in the wrong direction.
Ali, that's such a lovely Christmas.
I know, it is, isn't it? I did say this was the Christmas podcast. It's not exactly the most cheerful thing. We should really be doing a podcast on the Three Wise Men or something.
You'd definitely be one of the magi.
Well, what can I say? I quite like being a magi myself. I think it's quite a nice epithet. Is that the right word? I think that's a wrap for this particular review of events. And I'm sure we'll come back and revisit it in the new year. Who knows what will happen in the next few weeks. So we'll be back in January, I suspect, for our latest discussion.
No predictions, just some things to think about.
Historians don't predict, as we say.
They certainly shouldn't. Great, Ali. So thank you to you. Happy Christmas, dear listeners. And see you in the new year.
See you all in the new year. Bye-bye.